Jose, thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and a privilege to speak at such a wonderful conference in these historic times. And I have to admit, I'm very happy to be here with many leaders and managers because I truly hope this could become a decade of more enlightened leadership. I feel very strongly, and maybe you feel it as well, that in these days of anxiety, of big questions, of challenges and pressures, of risk and opportunities, and momentous redefinitions like seldom before, organizations need guidance. And not only organizations, but also our society at large. And I believe we as business leaders have a unique opportunity and also a responsibility to step beyond ourselves and maybe also to support each other with lessons learned and new ideas to shape a more sustainable future. But I also feel that many of the topics and questions we're discussing at our conference have been around for many years, and it's really time to get going. We got our toes in the water, but now we really need to pull through. So I immediately said yes when Fellow very kindly offered me to join you, and I hope that in the next 25 or 30 minutes or so, we can explore how together we could try to put a little dent in the universe, as Steve Jobs once suggested. So without further ado, let us dive into that wonderful world of business transformation. As I said, our world is becoming very complex, and I would like to ponder with all of you about a conundrum that has certainly kept me personally awake during the last 10 years or so. How can we create organizations where work is truly meaningful and where we both enjoy our daily jobs and contribute to a sustainable future for our company, our sector, and society at large? And I believe this is important. Whilst the so-called fourth industrial revolution is literally taking the world by its ears, our organizations have collectively produced numerous outcomes that nobody really wanted. There's burnout and loneliness, inequality and hunger, and ecological collapse. And by some estimates, more than $7 trillion are wasted every single year globally due to employee disengagement. And if that wasn't enough, whilst mankind is facing a historic inflection point, 56% of global citizens believe that capitalism does more harm than good. Hence, I think this is really the time when we need to take a step back and reflect. And I would like to share with you a few thoughts on three simple questions. Firstly, why are we really here? Secondly, how can we evolve our organizations to achieve our true purpose? And finally, who do we, each of us individually, need to become in order to make it work? And interestingly, I very often encounter people who tell me very earnestly that they deeply desire to become more agile or teal without ever really asking themselves the question why. And that is not surprising, is it? We've created a seductively materialistic and individualistic narrative in our Western society where often self-interested growth, productivity, and stock prices have become ends in themselves. In a pandemic of busyness, we've often succumbed to that hedonistic treadmill of money for money's sake, where people start to work ever longer hours to attain status or social acceptance or wealth, just to find out that it does not really make them happier. And in creating ever greater riches, arguably for far too few, we've often ignored ecologic externalities, just to discover that our mother planet is at the brink of bankruptcy and the collapse of global climate will threaten the livelihoods of millions. So what do we really believe in? What do we really stand for? And these questions are both existential and fundamental. We create organizations for a purpose, to achieve something together, which individually we couldn't possibly achieve. And I strongly believe that 50 years after Milton Friedman's famous essay on business, both personal and organizational success must transcend a quest for money and shareholder value. As Colin Meyer maintained at the World Economic Forum this year, it feels like years ago, the true purpose of organizations is to solve the planet's problems profitably. It is not just about profit and endless growth, but also about an inclusive and sustainable economy for all stakeholders, and about becoming those good ancestors for generations to come, not just bigger, but better. And in a world where traditional communities of churches and neighborhoods have been eroded, where scientific management has often filled gaps of meanings with the gospel of growth, and where work has become so central in our lives, I believe businesses also have to step up. As Immanuel Kant, the great philosopher, warned us a century ago, human beings must always be treated as ends in themselves, never as means, never as cogs in a machine. And not as a question of marketing or charity, but as a matter of morality and justice. Exploitation and inequality are not economic laws, but inherent failures of our economic system. And hence, I believe we must evolve societal and organizational success measures beyond GDP and profit before tax. And moreover, I think we really have to ask ourselves, are we and our organizations net contributors to that quadruple bottom line? Are we making a meaningful and measurable difference? Do we have those processes to create a reflective space to evaluate and balance our major projects against our values in place? And if not, let us take actions. Leaders must, I believe, accept the accountability to foster a conversation about integrity and values in their companies. Managers and leaders cannot remain morally mute when our very existence on this planet is at stake. Today, I believe we need human-centric and eco-centric organizations more than ever to provide a place of meaning and community where people can grow and flourish and attain that positive collective purpose together. And I actually believe many people today would agree with such an ambition, but struggle to understand how to evolve from where they are. And as a result, change is slow. And whatever consultants might sometimes suggest, there are no simple answers. Like people, every organization is different. However, I do strongly believe that we cannot just continue as before. We live in an ever more complex world, facing ever faster changes, advances in technology and data, shortening half-life of knowledge, and ever greater global interdependencies. And some researchers maintain that 65% of the future professions of people entering primary school today do not even yet exist. So I'm convinced that in these new 20s, we must let go of the illusion that work can be predicted or planned in detail. As BCG suggested last year, the companies that will win in the 2020s are those who can compete on learning. From a paradigm of scalable efficiency that has very much dominated our businesses since the Industrial Revolution, we need to transition into a new world of scalable learning and development, from competitive advantage to adaptive advantage, and from closed systems to boundaryless ecosystems. But the simple truth is that our world has become too complex to be controlled through bureaucracy. We cannot stand on a mountaintop and preach strategy down the hills to achieve successful execution. Hence, I think we need to revise how to create organizations that can do both, compete successfully and attain the purpose we desire. And those liberated organizations of the future must be able to create an environment where people can and want to make a difference in order to harness ideas from everywhere. In order to thrive, we need to both embrace uncertainty and maximize human flourishing at work rather than just driving efficiency and productivity. But how do we get there? So in my experience, if we want to enable self-organization and organizational learning at scale and move towards that teal paradigm, we need to have the courage to redesign work, adapting the context for our teams at multiple levels in terms of structure, management processes, and organizational practices. And above all, instead of moving those proverbial deck chairs on the Titanic and redrawing org charts, I think we need to consciously revise the distribution of information, knowledge, and power. Existing systems often distort or suppress information, and in the future, I'm convinced we need to move information not just upwards, but everywhere. As they say at VC, radical transparency should prevail. Everything is public unless it's harmful, so that strategy becomes a firm-wide conversation. And in terms of power and structure, central authority simply does not lend itself to decentralized experimentation and learning. At ING, we were one of the first banks to roll out Agile at scale globally. And as I think we've demonstrated, Agile can provide more flexibility within the pyramid, enabling that self-organization and cross-functional flow of information and decision-making. But I've also seen many Agile transformations struggle because they never dealt with existing power or ownership structures. And following on from Agile, I believe we will see more ambidextrous organizations that can enable the exploitation of the existing and the exploration of the new, but it won't stop there. We're already witnessing experiments with meshed and adaptive networks of teams, market-oriented ecosystems, and micro-enterprises like in Hire, and interconnected circles in holacracy and sociocracy. And in terms of management processes, organizational learning requires both order and freedom. Bill Torbert speaks here of liberating structures like principles and roles, routines, rituals, and methodologies to enable and host that generative dialogue involving as many people as possible. And often forgotten, learning also entails mechanisms to manage creative tension and conflicts. Innovation is at its heart creative destruction, and if we just sweep disagreements under the carpet, we will be ruined by our own empathy. We need constructive impertinence and a healthy disrespect for groupthink and bosses. However, by its very nature, total consensus would overwhelm complex systems, and hence, I think we need procedures to explicitly foster collaboration across diversity and attain not consensus, but consent. And finally, I'm convinced we must adapt sometimes anachronistic HR and finance practices. Support functions must become agile, but not just by organizing in tribes and squads, but by adapting their support processes to truly enable learning at scale. And a lot of these processes carry symbolic valence and have a huge impact. And one process I believe requires special attention is performance management, which very often is the cornerstone of a somewhat outdated behaviorist worldview. And here, target setting, rather than being a top-down cascade of numerous KPIs at the beginning of every year, trying to control the uncontrollable, I think needs to invest in bottom-up contracting and alignment for individuals and teams of not only what we do, but also how we can work with each other. OKRs are a strategic management approach, not simply a new MBO. And in finance, I think we need to evolve sometimes still rigid financial midterm planning and resource allocation towards beyond budgeting. From annual goal setting, we certainly need to move towards more recurring sprints. And in terms of performance feedback, here engagement needs to become continuous and facilitate self-reflection, peer coaching, and evolve from that feedback towards strength-based feed forwards. Focus moves from individual high performers towards team dynamic. As Manfred Kitz de Vries often said, many leadership teams are dysfunctional. And finally, for performance appraisals, I think we must revise those rankings and ratings. There's ample literature out there to prove that they simply do not work. And in terms of leadership development and promotion, I think they have to be highly based on ethical values and relational skills, not just conformity and the ability to control. And in learning and development, we should explore peer-to-peer learning and transparent skills-based compensation. And of course, we also need to digitize our support, but above all, I think we have to install those mechanisms for agile co-creation to truly serve our employees. And maybe this is eventually the moment to rename human resources, which as a name really does not reflect the value that our HR colleagues can bring. But we must be aware that we cannot just copy and paste best practices. As I said, every organization is unique. Hence, more than providing simple answers, it is critical to enable an environment where people can ask the right questions and collectively experiment and evolve. Together, let us liberate our organizations so that over time, they will become laboratories of ideas, integrating action and inquiry into everything we do, and always sensing and exploring and experimenting whilst we're moving in teams and in peer communities of learning. But there is more. In my experience, adapting the context does not necessarily mean that people will accept ownership. So how can we truly unleash the creativity of our people? And here for decades, we have been trained to see human beings as strictly rational consumers in economic markets. In our businesses, we have treated people like easily replaceable human capital or as exchangeable resources to be controlled. And as a result, more than 75% of employees feel disengaged. So going forward, to build those adaptive learning organizations, we truly must put people first. We must relearn to cherish their uniqueness and design our organization to fulfill their basic human needs, their sense of orientation, belonging, autonomy, and self-esteem. True success can only be when every human being at work has the ability to develop, use their creativity, and have impact, when agency becomes activism. And this won't be automatic. In a world where we are all required to wear many different masks, our public identity has become disengaged from our inner lives. And it has become challenging just to be with ourselves and with each other, resulting in dualisms and tension. And I think everything we call mental health is fundamentally related to interpersonal processes. As someone suggested, all problems are relationship problems, which would also explain why we're seeing such a strong impact during the pandemic. And therefore, in deliberately developmental organizations, we deliberately invest in helping people to go below that proverbial iceberg, individually and collectively, to recognize their own biases and needs, anxieties, attachment styles, defense and coping mechanisms, to grow their ability to work with and care for others, and co-generate that meaning and value in service of the community. Our inner game is our outer game. Or as Frédéric Laloux once said, we can only go far into the we if we fully inhabit the I. And finally, by matching desires and competencies of individuals with meaningful activities, we can enable flow, personal development, and ultimately happiness at work. And it does matter how people think about their lives. When people are happier, they don't just act smarter, they are smarter. Yet happiness, as Aristotle once suggested, is not so much about pleasure and wealth and income and how many followers we've got on Twitter and getting always all we want, but about growth. It is a matter of growing our character in a lifetime of personal development and the cultivation of those virtues and relationships that make us good human beings. And this brings us to culture. Let me ask you, do you feel you can truly bring your ideas to the front rows of your organization? Because if you feel no, then you're not alone. Only about 20% of people believe their opinion counts, and 70% report new ideas are met with hostility. And as people often suggest, culture is a little bit the way we do things around here, which arguably is not very precise. And for me, culture relates in particular to how we treat each other and what we truly care for. And if we want to develop those human-centric organizations, we need to actively foster an environment of psychological safety, openness, community, and compassion where people truly commit to co-elevate. Culture is not just the poster on the cafeteria wall. So do have a look at your own calendars and check how many hours you're spending on culture with your teams every month, especially in these new ways of working. The bottom line is that we have to become intentional and conscious about culture, not only inside the organization, but across our entire ecosystem, not only from the top, but inclusively across all the teams. We need to collectively create a space to revise and explicitly contract organizational culture. As they always say, culture eats strategy for breakfast. If we fail to manage our culture, then our culture manages us, and we are that breakfast. And I strongly believe this requires a change in metaphors. Instead of optimizing organizations as machines or behaviorist training grounds, dividing information and power and specializing and ruling with carrots and sticks, we need to start acknowledging organizations as complex developmental systems, as living organisms with minds and hearts and souls, where deep emotional bonds of community and trust prevail, and where individuals and teams experience, learn, and develop together in service of that regenerative purpose, where influence and authority are different from rank and position, and where employees have the freedom to experiment, where many, many more people become their own CEOs, from doing to being, and from fear to love. And more than in structures, methodologies, or tools, the difference lies in core principles. In humanocracies, the business of business is people. And this is where most of our organizations seem stuck. Why? I regret to say so, colleagues and friends, but I believe it is often because of us. The maturity of an organization can never transcend the maturity and consciousness of its leadership. If greater consciousness doesn't operate, a system simply does not possess the stability to let go of the past and transition to a new model. If our definition of success is going up that ladder from VP to SVP to EVP, hierarchy prevails. If we dominate others to uphold our own ego, people around us won't flourish. If we seek to control an uncontrollable and ever more uncertain environment with ever more rigidity, self-organization will perish. And finally, if we try to shrink the complexity of the world to our own cognitive limits, we will fail. In a world of self-organization, there simply is no place anymore for patriarchal commanders-in-chief who rule by positional power and dominance. Agile leaders focus on the why, not the how, and decisions are always made at the lowest possible level close to the customer. Rather than telling people what to do, I believe leaders today need to become experts in building and sensing and caring for and influencing organizational systems, in coaching individuals and teams, and in enabling that co-creation and emergence of shared purpose. And in such a world, we need chief communicators who earn the respect of their people by making personal sacrifices to serve the collective good, and chief connectors who can create a cultural force field of energy, placing their needles like acupuncturists to facilitate the energy flows in an organizational body, fostering psychological safety and trust, reinforcing transparency and embracing failure, and role modeling gratitude, compassion, and kindness. And such a new transpersonal leadership paradigm is more than just EQ. It integrates intellectual, emotional, and spiritual intelligence. Servant leaders lead beyond the ego, as John Knights writes, allowing time for awareness and reflection rather than jumping into action, letting go to become vulnerable imperfectionists, and holding the space for others to attain self-mastery and meaning. As John Quincy Adams once said, if your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, you are a leader. And if we're honest, for traditional leaders who have risen the corporate chain by being in control, this is a difficult challenge. What brought us here won't bring us there. So how can we transcend? What is that breakthrough? Now, I'm sure like many of you, I've spent most of my career trying to become a good leader. Yet nevertheless, if I'm fully honest, for a long time, being right was probably often more important than to accept uncertainty and to deeply listen and learn. And I still don't have all the answers. I'm always saying when I was young, I had all the answers. Now I'm old, I got all the questions. But in my personal experience, progression requires vertical development, facing our own shadows and our own emotions, letting go of restrictive mental models, and hearing our soul knocking at the ego's door. Responsible leaders, said Manfred Kitz de Vries, are not only born, but twice born through painful individuation, where every victory of the self feels a little bit like a defeat of the ego, until we can compassionately see all those facets of an interconnected whole. But above all, I believe we need to take the time to reflect and tap into what really matters to us, feeling how everything is profoundly interconnected, loving ourselves and others for mutual growth, serving life beyond the confines of our own ego. And similar to adopting a new metaphor for our organization, I think we need to reframe the meaning of our own world. And accessing that unique essence of who we are and what we stand for allows us to let go of fears and the desire to control. As Mark Twain once said, the two most important days in our lives are the day we are born and the day we find out why. And I can assure you, once you fully commit yourself to serve a greater purpose, magically, synchronously, the world outside you changes too. And suddenly, leadership is not a tribe of special individuals with special traits and not even a role, but about letting go of authority and unleashing that unique potential in everyone. About people no longer being victims of circumstances, but thriving in the creation of new possibilities. About learning together how to shape a more responsible future. And ultimately, leadership is a distributed and regenerative capability, an ecocentric flow of energy, what we collectively are able to bring to life. Not by top-down transformation or big bang organizational restructuring, but evolutionary through networks of teams and continual co-creation everywhere. And concluding, I want to offer you a final reflection. It took myself many years to acknowledge that sustainable organizational transformation is really only possible through concurrent individual transformation. We are the system. Yet that also means that we all have that power, and I feel the responsibility to transform our organizations and relationships from who we are and how we show up. We can all spark the liberation of our organizations, gradually crafting those structures and processes and cultures needed to attain both an environment for individual development and the evolution of that emergent collective purpose. And together, I'm convinced we can compose a new unifying narrative to overcome some of the limitations of that social materialism that we have today, where work has dignity and success is not only about money, but compassion, community, and character. But I also had to learn that true purpose is not only beautiful poetry, but also what we are personally willing to give up or to struggle and to suffer for. As St. Augustine once said, hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see they don't remain as they are. So I do hope that some of you are inspired to seize this historic moment to revise your bearings. The evolution of technology and data pose both critical opportunities and daunting challenges. The current pandemic lays bare the frailty of our social contract, and the economic lockdowns shine a glaring light on existing inequalities and even create new ones. And my heart really goes out to all those who are seriously impacted by COVID in their lives and their careers and their health. Today, I feel is an important time for all of us to occupy those front rows of our lives and make conscious choices. As I said at the beginning, we have our toes in the water, but we need to start pulling through, not as controllers, but as servants, not with a perfect plan, but starting somewhere and adapting and evolving whilst we go. You cannot think yourself into a new way of acting. You must act yourself into a new way of thinking. So finally, a big thank you to all those who have stimulated and influenced my journey to date, and to Fellow and the whole Craft Hub team and partners for organizing this wonderful virtual summit. And of course, to all you, fellow participants, please do connect and continue the conversation. Let us together roll up our sleeves and jointly reimagine our organizations for positive impact. Let us grow beyond ourselves and overcome fears to bring more love into this world at a moment where it is desperately needed. Let us spark a fifth revolution to recover better, recover stronger, and recover together. We are not leaders because we rule. We are leaders because we truly care. If not us, then who? If not now, then when? Thank you very much. Take care and stay safe. Goodbye.